So first of all, thanks for the great introduction. I am leading here at UTS the Behavioral Data Science Lab, and I'm entitling my today's talk "Slipping to the Extreme: A Mixed Method on to explain how extreme opinions infiltrate online discussions." But before I actually jump into it, I'm gonna basically give you a couple of context information, and most of all, the first context I'm going to give you is really Australia. So I'm based in Australia, at the University of Technology in Sydney. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick facts just to set up the mood a little bit. Now, that what you're seeing right now is the world map, according to the Australians. And you probably already know, undoubtedly seen that it's turned upside down. And it's also centered around Australia, on Australia, unlike what's usually the map of the world. That basically gives you a bit of the feeling of how Australian feels. We're here a bit, it's far away, which means that also we tend to see things. We tend to see ourselves also in the center of things. So in terms of another fact about Australia, it's that it is a huge place. In fact, it is a lot bigger than people think it is. And that has to do with some projections of a sphere onto a flat surface, making it look small. But in fact, it's a big place. In fact, you're going to see that a number of countries fit in Australia if you're going to overlay them, including Taiwan, which is over here. And you have other countries like Japan, Thailand, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, in fact, most of Europe, plus South Africa, they all would fit within Australia. So a pretty big place. So my university and my group are based in Sydney, which, in addition to being known for the famous opera and the bridge, it is my particular university is a city campus, and this is a photo of the main buildings in there. The one which is known and every single Sydney sider knows is the tower, shown here in the back, which is built in this iconic brutalist style. Also, what is known by the locals is that this building has been voted for about 10 years in a row now as the ugliest building in Sydney. So I have the big privilege of working next to the ugliest building in Sydney. I actually work in this new glass building that they built 2 years ago. But I don't know about you, but when you put something beautiful next to something ugly, it makes the ugly even uglier. But that's somewhat outside the topic of this presentation. So now my research group is called the Behavioral Data Science Lab. We are a moderately sized group, postdoc, PhD students, and master students. Also, shameless plug, we are currently also recruiting now. We have funded positions in both PhDs and postdocs in terms of detecting and fighting online misinformation with respect to offline behaviors. And which brings me to what we actually do. So, to put it simply, we are at our core, we are modelers. We build stochastic models, which can be very simply expressed like this. Whenever you're doing actions in the online environment, may it be you're writing a tweet, you're resharing a post, you're maybe sharing a link with one of your friends. These are called atomic level actions. That's because these actions are usually only visible to your immediate surrounding, and usually due to privacy reasons, they are not visible outside. However, when taken in aggregate level, these actions lead to collective level measures. These are things like popularity, virality, what catches on and what doesn't, how information spread. What we do at the Behavioral Data Science Lab, we build the simplest models which act at the atomic level, and then, when taken at the collective level, give rise to the phenomena that we see, that we can observe and measure. Because these collective level phenomena we can observe and we can measure. So this usually has been in recent years has been things like activities of social bots, the activity of trolls. We all know about the weaponization of social media, but also we are trying to address issues like hate speech, intolerance, bullying, problematic speech in general, also the spread of misinformation. So what is fake, what is true, how can you disentangle the two? So these are the broad topics on which we work, and we are quite active recently. And as I said, we have quite a number of positions also open in case there are people graduating soon in the auditorium. Cool. What am I going to be talking today is about three things. First, I'm going to tell you about how we approach interdisciplinary research, and mainly because doing research around problematic speech and misinformation diffusion is inherently an interdisciplinary problem. We need domain experts from communication science, social science, literature, and computer science to make it all work. And I'm going to tell you a couple of lessons that I've learned in doing interdisciplinary research, because I think that it might interest quite a bit the audience today, given the mix of social scientists and computer scientists in the audience. Then I'm going to be moving very quickly on a quick crash course on how to do social media analytics. You've already seen some of that by doing text analytics earlier today, but you're probably going to see some more during the program at SICSS Taiwan. So if you don't get everything that I'm showing here, it's probably okay. They are going to be rehashed in later lectures. And finally, I'm going to just show you an example of the research of how we combine the elements that I showed earlier in building a data set, combining qualitative research and computer science to fight problematic speech. So this is roughly what we're going to cover in the next maybe about 1 hour. Cool. So let me start with the fun thing, and then we're going to go more into the rest of the content. Lessons learned. So I'm a bit of a disclaimer. I am a computer scientist. So everything I'm telling you here is from the point of view of a computer scientist that has discovered the more social science and qualitative side of things. If you ask my collaborators, they might have different opinions. So I did put that disclaimer up that this is a computer scientist's point of view. Now, whenever we're doing research in complex topics which affect both society but also the methods and which need to be addressed as a whole, we usually need an interdisciplinary team. So, for example, when you're looking at problematic speech, we need expertise from communication science. So these would be the people that know how people communicate, how to and how they interact with each other. We need expertise from literature, which is how do you structure discourse, what type of discourse gets accepted and what it does not. And finally, you need computer science to scale it all up. And we have actually built a team which does exactly this. So we have 2 communication scientists, we have a literature scientist, and finally we have 2 computer scientists in the team. So what did we learn by doing this project over the past? I think it's been about 3 years now, and we've held a series of grants that have funded this research, including from a Facebook grant. So here are some differences. First of all, I learned that the same term may mean different things for different disciplines. First of all, the word paper. For computer scientists, a paper is the article draft that you're currently writing. You're usually doing this 3 to 4 weeks before a conference deadline when you're furiously writing the paper. For social scientists, a paper can mean anything, from a project, an idea, a discussion theme. And when I started talking to my colleagues, and they straight away they said, "Oh, on this paper we're doing this," and I was very confused. Which paper? We just started talking. It just that term means different things for us. Same stands for quantitative. What social scientists mean by quantitative, I usually consider qualitative. And what we mean by quantitative, it's too many numbers for them. And what they mean by qualitative, I can't do. Same for data, database, and there's a number of other terms. So usually we need to go past this difference in terms. The second big difference that I find between us, the computer scientists, and the social scientists is the approach of collecting data. On the left, you have the typical computer scientist's approach to collecting data, which is usually get data now, ask questions later. So we usually just crawl as much as we can, and then we filter down, which is not always the best thing you can do. A social scientist will sit down, will think about what answers what are the answers that the data need to give to you. They will structure the data, they will understand the dependencies, they will concentrate on what they need to collect and when. They will organize surveys, they will do interviews to complement the data. It's a well more thought. They are doing it with a lot more thinking than us computer scientists did. And I have to say that I learned a lot by working with them. Finally, I've learned that each of the fields has their own limits. I'm going to give you just some examples. I put it from the beginning. I'm a computer scientist. You may or may not agree with me, and I'm quite curious about your opinions on this at the end, but this is what I learned. Computer scientists tend to have simplifying assumptions about how the world works. For example, when building diffusion models about information, as a computer scientist, I usually said, oh, we just assume that every user is uniformly connected to everybody else. Obviously wrong. People are not uniformly connected to everyone else. There are cliques and stuff. So simplifying assumptions. Whereas social scientists will tend to do more naive assumptions, which I call wishful thinking, about what is technically possible. I remember my colleagues saying at the beginning of our project, oh, we will just collect all the Facebook posts with all the content, and then we will extract opinions and sentiments. And they meant it like that was a week's worth of work. It turned out it's not even possible to do that. So we need to account for the limitations. However, what did I learn? I learned that the whole is larger than the sum of parts. What do I mean by that? Working in an interdisciplinary team usually leads to a slow start. We took a lot of time to actually get our bearings right, but the cross-pollination is definitely worth the effort, because it opens the eyes, it did open my eyes to a wealth of problems and approaches, things that I just didn't know that existed. It simply makes one think in a completely different way about research. So even just doing interviews was never an option for me because of my quantitative approach. But now I'm actually thinking about it. Complementarity is usually the way you want to go. So don't necessarily team up with people who are exact duplicates of your skill set. And finally, by being involved in interdisciplinary projects and interdisciplinary research, it makes you grow as an individual, because the diversity of ideas leads to better ideas. Simply you're exposed to new things. So some tips and tricks. Okay, this is probably something you may wanna remember. Again, this is my point of view. The first tip is listen and don't judge. Really, we have different vocabularies. We have different methods, and it's easy to judge with our own set of eyes. So ask yourself this following question: if an entire field converges on a set of methods, there must be something right in what they do, right? So that naturally leads me to the next conclusion, is that sometimes it just happens that your own field is doing things wrong or suboptimal. For me, is when I realized that we did data collection wrong. We never put enough thinking into data collection. Everyone in my field does it like that, and I realized that it can be done better. It can be improved. Other tip: meet regularly. Just be there in a room with your colleagues and talk to them. And any kind of progress is better than nothing. And always explain your methods and approaches as simple as possible and as often as required. For example, I've been working with my colleagues for 3 years now, and just last week, one of my colleagues finally admitted that she still doesn't understand anything what I'm doing. So it took 3 years for her to admit that she doesn't get it, but she understands how it can be used, which is a huge, huge improvement. So, and finally, just keep doing it, because it pays off in the long term. So if you have the opportunity to work together with people from other disciplines, just make sure it's something you'll be comfortable and willing to do over a longer period of time, because that's when the value is being created. Very quick tips of tricks. I'm happy to chat a lot more about this in the end in the Q&A session. But that's as far as I went. Cool. Now, this whole mentorship, this is where the mentorship part of the talk ends and where the more teaching and learning part starts. And then finally, we're going to go more to the research part. Now, in the next session, in the next part of my talk, I want to give you an overview of the kind of tools that one would deploy when analyzing online social media. So I'm going to be talking to you about what is data, very quickly about what is an API, what is a classifier, how do you measure performance, and so on and so forth. Again, I'm going to be brushing the surface. If you don't get some of these bits, don't worry. Probably you're going to cover some other with in the rest of the summer school, and then there's heaps of materials that you can consult. But this is supposed to serve as more of a gentle introduction. And believe me, because I gave this course already, I know that some people don't feel it as gentle as I thought it is, but it is intended to be as gentle as possible. Cool. Big broad view. What is quantitative versus qualitative research? I found this sketch quite nice. In a quantitative method, one would set up an experiment and simply count, observe, and count. So for example, this little guy here is counting the number of people and the percentage of people that is taking the free ice cream. In a qualitative method, you would go beyond that. You would go and interview the people, trying to understand their reasons, their motives, and how they work. So one uses numbers, the other one uses usually interviews and more of an inductive reasoning. I'm going to be concentrating on the quantitative methods today. Whenever we're talking about data, particularly Twitter data, the way it usually works is the following way. You have your Twitter users that usually go along with their normal online lives. They tweet, they retweet, they share content, they share news. They just go ahead with their regular lives. Now, what we do is that we use what is called the Twitter streaming API, the Twitter API, and in this case, we're using the Twitter streaming API to listen on those tweets. The APIs are not necessarily developed for academic use. They're usually they are developed so that you can build applications on top of them. So remember, just imagine when you have those automatic tweeting platforms, or when you just bought something on Amazon and Amazon is proposing you to tweet about it automatically. Amazon in the background is using the Twitter API to write a tweet in your name. So we're using the same system, but in this time to listen to the tweets that have been emitted. And we're using a tool called Tweepy. There are many others, but Tweepy is one of the most mature set of tools that would allow you to capture the tweets and save them, store them on your machine. So this is how you get a tweet from the cloud, from the activity of the users, all the way to your machine. So how does a tweet look on your machine? Well, it looks like this. On the left, I have just taken an example tweet from a Korean author, and you may recognize a bit the layout of the tweet. On the right, you have the way it looks like in the data that you collect. So let me tell you a couple of things. So for example, you have the user called Sparkle, and this information would be captured in this field user, which is now not expanded for visibility reasons. You have the content of the tweet, which in this case is a retweet, and you'll find it in the text, which is right here. But you also have like the date the tweet was created. You're going to find here, it was the January 1st, 2020, January 1st, 2020 at 4 p.m., which translates, it's approximately 4 p.m. and this is the exact date in UTC. And then you have some information about this tweet. So for example, number of retweets, number of citations, and number of appreciations, which exist in the fields up here. So what we observe on the right is a JSON, which is a format, is a way of structuring data, which contains most of the information about what you see in your interface, and sometimes a lot more. So you can also see information about the users, such as where they are, their time zone, their description, and so on and so forth. We are using always with this, what we're using is what you see on your right. This is the part we're going to be using throughout whenever we're doing analysis of Twitter data. Cool. So what do you do with tweets? Let's say you want to analyze the text of the tweets. You've done some text analysis today, so you probably already know by now that you can take little pieces of text. In here, I've taken some tweets from Donald Trump, and you can actually plug them in what is called a matrix format, where each column here is one of the tweets. So this is the first tweet, this is the second tweet, and so on and so forth. And each of the lines is a word. This is one of the representations. There's many representations possible, but in this representation, I'm simply marking the frequency of appearance of a word within a tweet. So for example, the word "and" appears in the second tweet twice. And then the word "congressman" does not appear at all in the second tweet. So this would be a matrix representation of the data set collection. So based on this, I can already start doing things like word clouds. I can plot the frequency of appearance of each of the words, and the size would be I can plot the words that appear, and the size would be the frequency of appearing. So it already gives you some sort of a visual indication of what is happening in that collection. This basically tells you the kind of words that Donald Trump used in his tweets. You're going to see things like Fox News, Democrat memo, illegal. This was during the Mueller investigation, and Trump was pounding at how illegal it is. Okay, so I've taken now a bit through how we will get data from all the way from Twitter activity to getting it into this nice matrix format. So what do I do with it now? Well, let's move back to the aims of the quantitative research. Quantitative research basically says we are here to numerically count things. So that's the idea. It's based on counting. It's based on frequency. It's based on a number of relationships. But the basis of it is really about counting. Furthermore, you want to be able to determine the relationship between an independent variable or a descriptor and another variable, usually called the dependent variable or the outcome within the population. So you want to understand how one variable is linked to what we call the dependent variable. So why do we want to do that? We want to be able to do things like prediction, generalization, even causal analysis, to be able to understand how one factor affects another factor. And then doing statistical analysis. The realm is quite big. Today, I'm going to be concentrating on just two tasks, and that is prediction and generalization. And that's mainly what we're going to use today. How can you predict the class? So before I jump into it, you hear a lot about the term data science. So you know that this is a domain in high demand these days, but it's actually not, it requires knowledge from a number of domains: databases, statistics, visualizations, leveraging high performance computing, and so on. Machine learning is a tool used within data science, but data science is basically a confluence of a number of skill sets. So again, the skills that I'm telling you today about relate mainly to machine learning and general data science. Cool. All right, so let's jump into it. I can promise to you already that there's only 2 slides in these presentations that have math on them. And this is one of them. So bear with me. It's not going to last long. Machine learning deals with prediction. So you have examples, which are individuals, examples, exemplars, which are usually described by features. And this can be measurements. And we denote these features as x's, x1, x2, all the way to xn. And also these items, they have labels or annotations that we have attached to our exemplars. And we denote this by the y's, y1, y2, we can have multiple of them. The purpose of machine learning is to train a function, a predictor, which links the inputs to the outputs. So we want to build a function which allows me to predict the outcome based on the inputs, or to compute the outcome based on the inputs. And I'm going to come back to that, don't worry. When do I use machine learning approaches? Very simply put, when I do not have a mechanistic model of the phenomena. What does that mean? Let's say that I dropped this pen cap and it falls to the ground, I do not need machine learning to compute the speed at which it hits the ground. Why? Because we have a mechanistic interpretation of how the world works, and I understand the force of gravity, and I understand how speed is linked to acceleration. So I do not need machine learning. However, I deploy machine learning when I do not have mechanistic models of the phenomena, either because they are not known, or they're just too complex, or simply I just don't have a complete understanding of the world. I also deploy it when I have relatively large amounts of examples, and we're going to come back to that. So basically, I want to have a lot of individuals. And also when the outcomes, the labels, are well defined. So keeping that in mind, one important bit that I want us to sort of agree on is that prediction is not understanding. And machine learning, and like artificial intelligence, usually does not allow you to understand a phenomenon. The simple fact that I can predict something doesn't mean I am also capable of understanding that particular phenomenon. So it is increasingly important when we are applying machine learning to social phenomena. So the fact that I can predict the political leaning of a person, or the fact that I can predict the likelihood of retweeting, does not mean I understand why that person is retweeting or why that person is a Democrat. I want that to be quite clear at this point right now. We can do many, many things, but not everything. Okay, what is data? I already hinted at this, but I'm formalizing it a little bit more. In machine learning and in data science, we tend to like our tabular formats. So we like to see these big metrics where the lines are the objects that we are describing, and the columns are the variables which I'm using to measure. And then the values in the intersection is the value of a particular variable for that object. Okay, let me get that a bit more down to earth. The objects can be samples, patients, documents, images. Let's say we have patients. The dimensions can be anything: genes, proteins, words, pixels, depending on the application. Let's say that that this is a patient, and the variables are some measurements I'm doing for a patient at the admission: temperature, weight, height, body mass index, and so on and so forth. These are measurements about my patients, and that would be a good example. Okay, so what is now supervised learning? Supervised learning is, as we said, building that function, that H function. No, this is not the second slide with math on it. This doesn't count as math. Building the H function, which links the output, the Y, to the input. So as I said, maybe you're having patients and you're measuring four indicators for your patients, and the outcome is if they're healthy or if they have a disease. What I want to build is this function H, which takes as parameters my measurements and makes a prediction for the outcome. So a new patient comes in, and I want to be able to measure all these indicators and do a rough prediction if he suffers from an infection or not. So when this Y is a discrete output, like this case, it's called a classification problem. I need to put it into a class. I need to put an example into a class. When it's a numerical output, for example, I now need to predict the height of the patient or its income or their income, then it's called a regression problem. It's just denomination, and also the techniques are different. Okay, cool. You're going to see that the H is usually called a model or a hypothesis. And the reason why I'm calling it a hypothesis, I'm going to cover it later, is because I need to make some assumptions about the shape of that. So what are the goals of machine learning? The main goal, as I said, is predictive. Whenever I have a new sample, I can measure its attributes, and I want to be able to make a prediction. So, for example, I have a new patient coming in with these four measurements: 0.92, minus 0.33 false, and minus 0.48 for the four attributes. I want to be able to make that prediction, say for quick triage. But I can also use these models sometimes to help me guide with my understanding of the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. I said earlier, it cannot be used for interpretation usually and causality, but some of these models are actually easier to interpret than others. Oops. This, what you see here, it is the output of a decision tree. And a decision tree usually looks like this. If you have a condition, in this case, if A3 is false and A2 is lower than 0.33, then class is disease. So this would be a decision rule, which could, in some cases, help me to find the most relevant inputs to linking inputs to outputs. I'm not going to go too much into detail over this. There's an entire field in machine learning around interpretable AI and explainable AI. So there's a lot to be covered there. I'm not covering it in this lecture. Okay. But what is the general workflow of deploying a machine learning algorithm? Well, you have it very quickly in this schema. There are two parts. There is the training phase, and then there is the prediction phase. The training phase is when I train my model, when I train the function. So usually what I have an input, say my text from Twitter. I do my feature extraction, and I build that matrix version, that vectorial representation of my data. So that matrix that you saw earlier. And now I have two data sources. I have the features for each data point, and I have a label for it because I need to have a labeled data set, a set of examples. And I put both of these through a machine learning algorithm. Now, we're going to pause here for a second, and I want to explain a bit of a distinction. There is a difference between the machine learning algorithm and the classified and the classifier. The machine learning algorithm is a set of assumptions and procedures to link the descriptive features to the label, to the class. But when I have fitted those values, when I have trained it for my precise problem, I talk about the classification model. So the classification model is an object, is an instance of the machine learning algorithm. Once I have this is the moment when I can now start making predictions. So how do I make predictions? I get a new data point, I put it through the exact feature extractor as earlier, and I get a set of features, and then I use it together with my classification model to get the predicted label. Okay? So repeating, I use my training data together with a set of assumptions in the machine learning algorithm to build a classification model, and then I use new data points together with the classification model to predict labels. That's the general framework. Okay. So let me take an illustrative problem, and I'm going to drive you a bit through it. Same thing, medical diagnostics, and I'm just going to make it down to two measurements, weight and temperature for each patient. So I have a set of examples. These are the measurements on weight. This is the measurement of temperature through some kind of normalization. That's why it doesn't look exactly as you would expect it to look. And I can plot it now on a 2D space. So weight, temperature, and then the green points are the healthy individuals and the red points are the ones with the disease. The goal is to find a model that best classifies any new case. So that usually comes down to understanding what is the boundary between the two classes. For example, something like that. So when I have deduced this boundary, this is called that I have built a model to separate the two classes. I can say anything above the model line is the disease class, anything below the model line is the healthy class. And then how do I predict for a new individual? It's simple. I measure the weight, I measure the temperature, I plot it in the area, and let's say if it lands here, I'm saying it is disease free. If it lands there, then I say it is diseased. So really the difficulty here is finding this boundary. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about now. How do I build that boundary? I usually need to make assumptions about how that boundary looks like. I can say it is linear. And this is how a linear boundary will look separating the two classes. I can say it is quadratic, which is dependent on the square of each of the variables. the best fit would look like this. Or I can deploy some really complex neural network approaches, and I can build a crazy boundary like the one that I'm showing you here in the third example. Cool. So which one is the best? How do I choose the best one? How do I know which boundary is the best? Obviously, the neural net one actually gets no error, but is that the best boundary? Turns out that in order to be able to make that decision, I need to look at what is called the generalization error. Why is that? Because I can overfit, and I'm going to tell you that in a second. So how do I do the generalization error? Generalization error basically means I want to see how the boundary that I have built performs with future data points. But I cannot have future data points, right? I only have a set of labeled points. That's when I use the test set method. How do I do that? I take a set of examples, like the ones shown highlighted here in blue, and I hide them. I put them aside. And then I train the model on only the other points. So let's say I take 30% of the data, it becomes the test sample, and I build the modeling based on the remaining 70%. And I get this, and then I get the decision boundary shown here in the magenta. And now I can bring back the test sample, and I can predict its label for each of the individuals. So what do I have now? I have now I can say that, for example, this individual is predicted as diseased when in fact it is healthy, whereas no, that's it. And all these guys are well predicted, whereas this one and that one are badly predicted. So this gives me an idea of how well do I do. Okay. So with this information, I go back and I start evaluating my models. So let's say my linear model, it has a learning error of 3.4% and a testing error of 3.5%. My quadratic has a learning error of 1% and a testing error of 1.5%. And finally, my neural net model has a learning set error of 0%. It does perfect in the learning, but it has a training set error of 3.5%. Now, why is that? I call that the linear model has underfitted. It is not powerful enough to capture the complex dependencies. However, I say that the neural network model has overfitted. It has taken into account all the noise in my data set that it cannot really predict well for new data. And in that case, here I can decide to pick the quadratic model because it has the lowest training set error, which is also called the generalization error. But when I'm doing the learning set, I'm actually exposing myself to random splits of the training set. So a better way of doing it is via cross-validation, which also allows me to understand how the standard error that I'm making. Cross-validation, very simply put, is randomly partitioning your data set into k subsets. So I'm taking all the labeled data and I'm splitting it here in 10 sets. And then what I'm doing the following iteration. I'm learning on 9 folds, 9 sets, and I'm testing on the 10th one. And then I'm switching the test set. So how many trainings do I do? 10. How many testings do I do? 10. Because I simply move the testing set for each of the folds. Why is this better? Because then I can report the mean error rate over the k subsets, and I can also look at the standard deviation, which tells me how confident I am in that prediction, as opposed to just being a random split. I can do something else with cross-validation. I can look at model complexity. So think about it this way. If on the x-axis I have model complexity, for example, model complexity can be the assumptions. Linear would be low complexity, quadratic would be medium complexity, and neural networks would be high complexity. And on the y-axis, I have the error. In red, I have the cross-validation error, and in green, I have the learning set error. What you usually see is that as complexity increases, the learning set error converges to almost 0. But what we also usually see is that the cross-validation error decreases up to a point and then starts increasing again. This is the overfitting regime, and the previous one is the underfitting regime. And the optimal complexity is where the cross-validation error actually has the minimum. So there you go. I just showed you how to pick the best model based on complexity analysis. And then you probably, by now, you figure out that I've talked about a number of things, except how do I measure error? I keep saying error here and I keep saying error there, but how do I actually measure it? Where? Here, enter the second slide with math on it. That's it. We're going to be talking really quickly about performance measures. So let's assume the simplest case when it's a binary classification. I need to predict true or false for my individuals. What I'm showing you here on the right is called the confusion matrix. The confusion matrix has only 4 cells because in the lines show you the actual values. So the value of a data point in reality can be positive or negative. The lines show you the predicted values. This comes out of my model. Again, positive or negative. And it has 4 cells. The first cell shown here in green, both green cells are correct. The red cells are negatives, so they are incorrect predictions. Let's see. This green cell is called true positives because the model predicts them as true, and they are indeed true. Yay, this is thumbs up. The bottom cell here is the true negatives. So the model predicts them as negative, and they are in fact negative. Again, good for us. But we have 2 types of errors. We have the false positives, which the model predicts as positives, but in fact they're negatives. And then finally, obviously, we have the false negatives, which the model predicts as negatives, but in fact they're positives. Now, just a quick word of warning, the 2 types of errors usually may not have the same cost. Think of the medical screening procedure that I told you earlier. And let's say that I'm trying to detect cancer. The cost of the 2 errors is not the same. Let's take an example. A false positive means that the model says that I have cancer, but in fact I don't have it. What is my cost? I'm going to spend a week with investigations and maybe biopsies. I'm going to be scared, and in the end I don't have cancer. Hooray, I go and I live my life. What is the negative? What is the false negative? Well, the model says I don't have cancer, but I do. And that's a pretty big cost in terms of lost lives. So the 2 types of errors are usually not the same cost. Okay, so what do I build with this? Well, I can build things like the error rate, which is the sum of the errors over the total, accuracy, which is the 1 minus error rate, which is the sum of the true positives and true negatives over. Accuracy is also the ratio of all my correct answers. And accuracy is usually a very bad indicator of performance. I'm taking a bit of time to tell you this because everybody uses accuracy and it's not a good technique for it. Again, I'm going to use my cancer example. The incidence of cancer is usually about 1% or low or less. So a lazy classifier will simply predict that all cases are negatives. What is the accuracy of a lazy classifier? Well, out of 100 cases, 99% of them are not cancer. So true negatives is 99. True positives, 0, because it only predicts non-cancer. And false negatives is 1. Correct? The accuracy is 99 over 100. My lazy model has an accuracy of 99%. And it is useful? No, it doesn't detect cancer. It just says no all the time. So accuracy is not a good indicator of performance, particularly when you have imbalanced data sets. What are better options? Getting precision and recall, which are defined as how many of the ones that I predict as positive are in fact positive, and how many of the true positives do I find. So they are the true positives over the sum of the line and the true positives over the sum of the column. But even that doesn't necessarily tell me all the picture. What I really want, to have both high precision and high recall at the same time. I want to find all the cancers, and whenever I make a predictions, I want to be correct. So that's why we usually measure F1 score. F1 score is the harmonic mean of precision and recall, and it has this property that when it goes down, when only one of them goes down. So the only way to put up your F1 score is by having both precision and recall high. So If you want to learn one thing from this lecture, apart from that interdisciplinary research is good, the second thing you may want to get out of here is just use F1 when you measure performance. Just do that. Do yourself that favor. And with this, we can breathe. We're done with the crash course and with the more teaching-oriented part of the lecture. In the final part of my presentation, I'm gonna be telling you about a recent piece of research that we have published at the International Conference on Web and Social Media, ICWSM, which is one of the premier venues of computational social science. And it is around combining qualitative research and computer science to fight problematic speech. And we entitled it "Slipping to the Extremes." I'm going to tell you at the end. You're gonna figure out at the end why we're looking at that. So, as I said, it was published quite recently, a couple of months ago. It was published at ICWSM. The purpose of that research is problematic speech. We define problematic speech as online interactions, speech, and artifacts that are inaccurate, misleading, inappropriately attributed, or fabricated. This usually covers misinformation and disinformation, to which we add hate speech. And hate speech is a big part of it. And we can further delineate hate speech into offensive and hate, depending on the target of the hate speech. But let's just take this very broad definition of hate speech. And I don't think I need to tell you why we don't like this in our online communities. It leads to cyberbullying. It just leads to a nasty environment. We just don't want that. So what can you do about it? Well, before I jump into the why, I want to tell you just a little bit about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, because I get asked a lot. The difference is really intent, right? So take two dimensions, falseness and intention to harm. Misinformation is what my grandma does when she talks to her friends. She tells a lot of fake things. She tells things that does not exist, but she doesn't mean it. She's not bad intent. She's not badly intended. She just tells things which are not true. That's misinformation. Unintentional, mistaken spread of inaccurate informations. Okay, what is malinformation? I'm going to jump here on the right. Malinformation is simply just information intent to harm. It is not necessarily fake, mind you. It is not necessarily false. It may be, for example, leaking private information. Your private information is not false information, but you definitely don't want it out. If I put your personal information out, I intend to harm you. That is malinformation. Disinformation is in between the two. It is false information leaked with the purpose to harm. So that's the difference. The difference between misinformation and disinformation, they're both false, but disinformation has an intent to achieve some usually malintended goal. Cool. Now, whenever we try to address problematic speech, we tend to have two types of approaches. And I already alluded to this at the beginning of my talk. This is the computer science approach, my approach, where we just do things at scale. So we can solve problems such as large-scale monitoring of social media. We can identify platforms and users and networks that contribute to the infodemic. We can build models and predict the future spread. We can do things at scale. On the other hand, you have the social science qualitative and ethnographic approach, and they usually can do things like understanding exactly how information is shared, how opinions are formed, which are the sources. So, qualitative methods have the advantage of being precise, but they are not representative usually. The computational methods tend to scale up, so we can deal with very large volumes of data, but they are not very precise. You see, precise but large. Imprecise but at scale, very precise but do not scale very well. So you can probably realize by now what we're trying to do. We are trying to leverage both together. Can we leverage both qualitative and quantitative for studying problematic speech? Basically, can we accelerate qualitative research? Can we augment the qualitative researchers with machine learning algorithms? And in doing so, we are trying to track the dynamics of problematic opinions and sort of form hypotheses of how they infiltrate our discourse. How do people come up with these particular opinions? So this is our solution, and I'm going to use it as a plan for the research part. We propose a solution in 3 parts. The first is a full-blown qualitative study shown here in green. The second is unlabeled data collection, and then finally in blue, I'm going to show you how we augmented the qualitative research, and this is our main contribution. The blue is the main contribution. So, qualitative study. We started from 4 topics. We were interested in the Australian bushfire season in 2019-2020. For those of you who were curious about that, 2 years ago, Australia has had one of its worst bushfires in recent history. We were interested in climate change. We are interested, obviously, in COVID, which also started about the same time, and obviously topics about vaccination. Overall, our study period was from December 2019 until January 2021. Our qualitative researchers, shown here in the middle, started by looking at internet places. So these were news stories. They monitored particular Facebook pages. They tracked links across postings, and they even looked at what the platform recommended to them. So this was an inherent qualitative analysis. They started by simply reading and understanding where this information is shared. By doing so, they created a vocabulary of 614 postings. Sorry, of 65 opinions with which they label 614 postings. So it is important to note that these 65 opinions were emerged through the qualitative study. We had 2 researchers working on this, and they had an annotator agreement of about 81%. But this vocabulary of opinions was emerged from data. So you find things like climate change crisis isn't real, United Nations is corrupt, but you also find things which are pretty crazy. You know, men are being chemically emasculated by the government or the science and the elites. Pretty crazy stuff. So we stored all this data into an installation called Wikibase, which is a knowledge graph which looks at relations between 3 types of entities. The posting was one message emitted on our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. Opinions are this vocabulary of 65 opinions that our researchers built, and the topics are the 4 topics that we started with. So these are the 3 entities. And this was the qualitative study. And I'm going to show you one example here. This was from a public Facebook group called Take Australia Back. This particular post was taken in January 2020, and what are the specificities of this group? So it was more of a discussion group. There were respectful debate, mainly text-based. The user group was between 40 and 60 years old. There was some use of misogynistic and inflammatory discourse, but it was mainly well moderated and really just discussions. However, fast forward only 9 months, and the group looks completely different. We start seeing memes being generated. Mind you, this is already the COVID era and in the intervention, so about face masks. We start seeing religious symbols. The user base gets a lot younger. So this group has been taken over by a new type of activists, by a new type of people that were debating in that group. Okay, so these are the kind of insights that we found by doing the initial study. The second step was just labeling, collecting data. So what we did exactly as what I showed you. We started from the APIs of the data sources. So we used the Twitter API, the Twitter developer. We used the CrowdTangle for Facebook and YouTube data API. And we started from a set of hashtags, which are shown here, and we collected a lot of data. So these are the hashtags. We grouped our topics 2 by 2. So we put the bushfires and the climate change together, and these are the hashtags that we used, and COVID and vaccination, and those are the hashtags. You're going to see that those hashtags are very, very wide. So we were not looking at specific instances. We are simply looking for any text that was somewhat related to our topics. And we just collected everything. We did the computer science approach here. So we have about 11.4 million Facebook posts, about 2 million tweets, and almost 100,000 YouTube comments. And they are temporally distributed, as you see here, with x-axis being time. You're going to see that Twitter, shown here in green, actually has only these 2 peaks. That's because we had to buy the data in retrospect. The Twitter developer API has not, version 2 was not already out. So we spent a lot of money in buying that data. So we had to be quite precise in what we wanted. We wanted the peak of the bushfire season and then the beginning of the COVID crisis in March 2020. Cool. So what do we have now? On one hand side, you have a very narrow and precise qualitative analysis, and then you have a lot of data. What do you do with that? Well, here's our main contribution. We're going to use machine learning classifiers, exactly what I've been talking to you and been bugging in the middle part of this presentation. Using labeled examples which have already been stored, we're going to train classifiers to identify the opinions. But then, what we're going to be doing, we're going to ask the classifier what other data should be labeled to further the training. So we're going to sample new data from the unlabeled set, and we're going to give it back to our humans, our labelers, who are going to label it and going to put it back in the data set. And we're going to repeat this process until some form of convergence, or until our qualitative researchers get bored of it. But it was converging. So this is how we predict the topics. First of all, we're using a set of classifiers to predict the topic of a posting. That's because our query was so large that we have a lot of off-topic. So a lot of texts don't talk about our topics at all. So this would be the result of the first level of classifiers, which predicts the topic. And if it is in topic, then we have opinion classifiers, 1 per opinion. If you're asking what kind of opinions we used, what kinds of classifiers we used, we tried a number of things like random forest, FBM, XGBoost, but unsurprisingly, the one that worked best was Roberta, which is a transformer neural network-based architecture dedicated for social media. So no surprises there, nothing fancy. We just applied a deep neural network architectures. But here's what we did in order to do the human-in-the-loop machine learning. This is called the human-in-the-loop machine learning because a human is embedded into the loop of training the machine learning algorithms. So a human is really supervising the whole procedure. So as I said, we take all the data that is labeled, we train the classifiers, and then we have 3 strategies of selecting new data to further sample. The first strategy is called active learning. So active learning selects the postings of which the classifier is least sure of. So in terms of my drawing of classifier boundary that I showed you earlier, these would be the individuals which are closest to the decision boundary. And we select 10 of these posts per iteration and per topic. The second type of individuals that we wanted to further annotate is the top confidence ones. This is because we wanted the postings for which the classifier is most sure of, but we also didn't want the classifier to go completely haywire and predict complete nonsense. So we wanted to constantly keep a check on the classifier. So we labeled 10 more posts per iteration per topic. And finally, because we wanted to understand how well we cover the entire landscape, we also did a random sampling where we simply selected 5 posts per iteration per topic. You're going to see that we have 10 plus 10 plus 5, 25 posts per iteration per topics times 4 topics. That is 100 posts per iteration that were labeled by our social scientists. So we do this loop until convergence. So how do we measure convergence? Stay tuned, because I'm going to show that right now in the results. I'm showing you here on the x-axis the iteration numbers. So this is the original iteration where this is the original iteration with no learning and then after the first iteration, second, all the way to the seventh. On the left, I'm showing you the macro accuracy. On the right, I'm showing you the macro F1. You're going to tell me right now, you're going to ask me, but why are you showing accuracy if you tell us not to use accuracy? Because at the review of the paper, they asked us accuracy. So we just put it also there next to it. And then, but I'm just going to be talking to you about F1. In gray line, you're going to see the cross-validation error. So this is the generalization error. Simply put, this is how good the classifier thinks it does. And as you can see, the classifier is pretty consistently believing that it's doing great, even when it was doing really bad. That's because the classifier doesn't know what it doesn't know. It gets almost philosophical, but we use this as a baseline to understand how good the classifier actually does by measuring the difference to the test set error, shown here in full red. This line was built on a completely different test set. So we asked our social scientist experts to label another set of postings that we never showed to our classifier. They were completely aside. And we always evaluated on those. The gap between the test set and the generalization error tells you how far your classifier is from reality on the terrain. As you can see, this gap is actually diminishing quite fast at the beginning, but then it sort of converges. Also, you see that the performance does not quite increase between the sixth and the seventh iteration. When we saw this, we decided that we have converged and we stopped the procedure. That's what we call the convergence. Now, the vocabulary also, so the number of posts between the first iteration went from 614 posts in the first iteration all the way to almost 1,400 posts in the seventh iteration. So we labeled more posts, but that's not what's the most interesting bit. The vocabulary also evolved. There were new opinions that we found through this process that the social scientists didn't find before because they did not see wide enough. So this is an important bit to keep in mind, that this procedure allows you also to explore the space, not just label it. Finally, and I'm almost reaching the end. Once we did all of this, we retrained all the classifiers on everything we had, and then we labeled everything, all the data. So it turns out that about 21 million posts were off topic. So most of our data set was just useless, was garbage. And then we have about 1.7 million postings with at least one opinion and 314,000 with two or more opinions. And you see here a bit of the dynamics of how opinions fared over time. So you see some opinions increased. So for example, mainstream media cannot be trusted was an opinion increasingly popular, whereas climate change isn't real started decreasing through our data set. Further, the social scientists also started splitting the opinions into two types: conspiracy opinions and other opinions. And what I'm showing you here is the frequency in hundreds of thousands of each of the opinions. This is the popularity of an opinion. The most popular opinion was that mainstream media cannot be trusted. And so that's quite interesting. COVID-19 is a scam and climate change crisis isn't real. You're going to see that the popularity is power law distributed, with the first and the second and the third actually having most of the popularity over everything else. This is not surprising. Whenever we're talking about popularity in social media, we see long tail distribution. But also what you see is that out of the top 6 opinions, 4 are what we call conspiracy opinions. And I'm going to go closer into that. In order to understand our hypothesis, how do opinions actually infiltrate the mainstream media, we looked at the co-occurrence network. So now we look at pairs of opinions when they co-occur in the same posting. So here I'm showing you the pair climate change isn't real and climate change is a UN hoax, which tends to be quite often and constantly co-occurring in our data set. This other pair here, which is quite awful, so I'm not going to read it to you, has a diminishing correlation as time goes by, whereas the third pair, which is linked to bushfires and climate change, has an increasing association. So, based on this, we start forming our hypothesis. And let me take you through the data first. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and I'm going to be looking into the graph of opinion co-occurrence. On the right, each of these bubbles is an opinion. The size is the degree, and the color is the centrality. So centrality is basically how central is an opinion to the network as a whole, and higher centrality usually means you're closer to the central parts of the network. So you're more important, you'd say, or more connected. One thing that we observe is that there are the main opinions of our data set. Climate change is a UN hoax, really high in degree. Climate change isn't real. Again, very prominent opinion. These opinions are the centerpieces of all the environment, all the problematic speech environment in Australia at the time. However, you are going to see that there are some conspiracy opinions shown here by the circles, which have very high in degree. So Australian bushfires were deliberately lit. This is the arson thesis that bushfires were lit by humans on purpose. And then, the crazy opinions about chemtrails and elite secret technologies on the bottom here. So here we form our hypothesis. We've hypothesized that conspiracy opinions and other sort of more fringe opinions are being pushed within the discourse and the narrative by making them co-occur with the more prominent opinions. They are being rationalized and they are being popularized by making them co-occur with the more established opinions. This way, people get in contact with them and they become palatable more and more. And if this would be a social science presentation, you would start with your hypothesis and then take your research forward. But because this is an interdisciplinary research and presented by a computer scientist, I'm actually going to end on that hypothesis. Further research is going to prove if we are right or wrong. So, in summary, I have shown you, I've talked for a while now, and I hope I didn't bore you to death, but I've touched about a couple of points. The first point, I've told you a bit of lessons learned from working in an interdisciplinary team trying to solve a very difficult task. And I shared with you some of my insights on how to make that work. I'm really open to your suggestions or opinions. Then I showed you how to build a mixed qualitative and human-in-the-loop machine learning approach to detect problematic content, which led to building a representative annotated data set of online problematic content. Now, as far as we are aware, this is probably the largest annotated data set of problematic speech in existence, as far as I'm aware. Again, I'm happy to be corrected. And I finished on a hypothesis of how fringe opinions infiltrate mainstream discourse by co-occurrence with more established opinions. Before I end, just a quick note on the data set. We cannot share it due to Twitter's terms of service. We can't make it publicly available, but for research purposes and on a private base, it can be shared at least partially. So some of these bits could be, I could share samples of the data sets if people are interested. And again, just reminding people that, shameless plug, my group has work and employment opportunities in fields related to this. So very exciting stuff. With that, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for your valuable and informative talk about your experience in behavioral data science and the interaction between social science and data science. So maybe we have some time for QA. So is there any participant have question to ask Andrei?
Hi. Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yes, Hayan.
Hi. So as we saw here, there's a you said in your presentation you mentioned there's a group that usually have like 50%, 50%, like pro climate change and 50% like, oh, maybe that's just a lie and things like that. And you say like about 9 months later they are, oh yeah, that yeah, and you said maybe 9 months later your team observed that it's took over by someone I don't know, by another group. Yeah, about the mask, right? You saw us these picture. I'm just interested in like, have you ever think about the possibility about like the change moment, or like, you know, like how these specific social group like try to guide the trends of, I don't know, the public opinions and things like that? Because as you can, as the data you show me, or as the data you show in this presentation, it's just like a critical moment, or there's a mechanism like this is not, I don't know, it's like it's not happening all at once, but it looks like there's a pattern, and you have all these posts or this data, and then you have these two groups of great social scientists and the computer science. Is like a possibility, like we can, I don't know, have you ever seen, and your team have ever think about like, oh, maybe we can do more research about that, like how a possible public space was took over by a group of crazy people and guide the trends of discussion and things like that. Yeah, I'm just like curious about this.
Yeah, no, great question. And yeah, obviously we ask the same question ourselves. When you see such a phenomenon, the first thing you ask yourself, why? So this particular work is was really about building the data set and annotating the build data set. So in the great scheme of things, this would be a data set building paper. We currently look at two bits. One is about really the far right takeover, because what this hinted us towards is that there's been an increasing presence of the more far right and far right leaning groups in Australian discourse, and this is something where we've been looking at, and we've been looking at how do you identify the far right ideological leaning of these individuals and some of the techniques that they're doing. So we do have currently ongoing and under review two papers. One is a more qualitative analysis of the discourse around not necessarily about the takeover, but rather the techniques that these groups used to evade censorship from Facebook. So we didn't exactly address the question you raised because we didn't think about it, but it's a great question also. But what we looked in there is moderating escaping techniques, because Facebook has said that they are moderating these communities when in fact they are thriving, and we looked into how they managed to escape moderation. And you know, quick caveat, a quick spoiler alert: it is they started using code words, they started using images and memes instead of text to avoid automatic moderation. So there is that piece of work, and then there's a more quantitative work where we look at the far right activism and far right activity within the Australian environment. So yes, that is a long way of saying yes, we have a rich research agenda following on this on some of the data in this data set, and there's a lot of things we can do. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful because like as you describe, as you explain like what you have done, it seems like on the process of like building the data set, you can also explore like a new research topic and the possible, you know, possible research questions. So it's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I agree that there's a lot of possibilities opening up, and I want to flag one thing. This particular methodology is not limited to, so I'm talking about this methodology shown here in blue is not limited to just problematic speech or hate speech, but it is really a method to accelerate the digital qualitative research. because it allows to have a machine learning trained classifier to help the scientist on the side to propose new postings to be labeled, to maybe propose a labeling, automatic labeling for the scientist, just to check. As a rule of thumb, step one took about 3 months to complete. The blue step in here took us about 2 to 3 weeks to build all the 7 iterations, and the final data set labeling of the entire 22 million posts took 2 hours. So it scales up things quite quickly.
But you mentioned earlier it took about 3 years to build up the team or collaboration. Yes. So it's like in the beginning it's a slow pace, and then you will like pace. And then you guys like working on together and figure out how to contribute and how to work together, and then design this research together. Yes. Something like that, like a
yes, we had a couple. Yes, and plus this was been a bit. It's a bit behind us now. So, but yes, it took us a long time of just talking together and understanding where we want to be and where do we want to work. Even the fields in which we wanted to work were very different. So getting over some of those difficulties of interdisciplinary work was challenging. So I was not emphasizing, or I was not emphasizing too much the difficulties of setting up interdisciplinary agendas. At least for us, it took a bit of time. But once it was set up, it worked really well, and it works still pretty well.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Andre and Saiyan. Another participant, Zhang Yu, have questions. So Zhang Yu, are you able to directly ask the question?
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. I want to ask 2 questions. One is that I think one of the difficult parts of the research is labeling the opinions. Could you tell us more about this part? How you decide the number of opinions, the level, and the labeling criteria? And I want to ask the kappa value. Yeah. And another question is that it seems that there are many robot or fake accounts on Twitter and other social media. How do you exclude this account influence? Thank you.
Really great questions. Note that I'll probably be able to answer to part of it, because some of these decisions were made by my social sciences colleagues, who are not here. But the opinion vocabulary was emerged during the study. We had no ideas of how many of them there will be. Really, we didn't start with a number in our thinking. They simply were browsing the internet places, and they found opinions that were considered being problematic, and they would write them down. Then they would sometimes merge opinions when they found that they were too specific, or they would split opinions when they thought that they were too wide. It was done so the inter-annotator agreement, which is similar to the Krippendorf's alpha. I assume that's what you wanted that's the value you wanted from me. This is the inter-annotator agreement, not the Krippendorf alpha. But very similar message, was 81%, but 81%. But however, conflicts were solved via discussions. So the social science team would be meeting weekly or on a bi-weekly basis, and they would be comparing notes. And when there were conflicts, they would discuss about them. So usually the opinion generation process came out of these discussions. So they would disagree about which opinions to label with. So they would figure out that they need a new opinion, or that some opinion was too broad or too specific. And during this iterative process, we ended up with our 65 opinions. So we didn't know how many opinions we're going to have at the beginning, and there was no real guidance there. We just let it emerge from the data. We used principles of digital ethnography, but we don't call it digital ethnography because the researchers never really interacted with the participants. So it's not real ethnography. It is more like a deep qualitative study. But the principles were very similar to a digital ethnography. Oh, yes, bots. Yes, there was a second part of the question. Bots. How did we exclude the influence of bots? There is a very simple answer to that. We didn't. So we didn't look into the bot dimension in this work. So it's very likely that all the bots are still in there.
Okay, thank you for answering. Thank you.
Wait, I need to follow up. Then if it's still there, how do you determine like the validity of the data or like the quality of the data, or like what's the percentage of it's a real person or it's a bot? How do we know what's a good standard?
Well, the data does not include. Does it include retweets? It includes retweets. So the data includes retweets. But note that most of our data actually comes from Facebook. So on Facebook, the problem of bots is not as large as in Twitter. Oh yes, the bots. Well, we don't really worry about bots because we collected this data from Twitter in hindsight. So we collected this data about 8 months, I think, 7 months after the fact. That's why we had to buy it. And Twitter already suspends a lot of these automated accounts, and when they suspend it, their data disappears. So there's not a lot of bots in our data. Normally, we would filter it out. We have our own in-house bot detection system, and we can use botometer and things like this. But I don't think there's too many bots in there. We haven't looked for it, but given how long it's been since data publication until now, I honestly wouldn't worry too much. I wouldn't be too worried about bots.
I see. Thanks.
Oh, good questions. Really good points. I'm happy I didn't have you as reviewers for the paper.
Social scientists focus on this. Take it very seriously.
No, this is good. This is good. Or maybe you were the reviewer too.